Welcome back to the channel, guys. My name is Ayomide, and on this channel I post sewing tutorials. As you can see, in today's tutorial I am going to be sharing how to make a notch collar, how to draft, cut and sew a notch collar. The emphasis of this tutorial is going to be on the collar itself, and once you have an idea of the collar, you can make this into a jacket, you can make this into a dress like I did. So the emphasis of this video is going to be on how to cut, how to draft your pattern, cut it and sew a notch collar. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please click on the subscribe button below, turn on your notifications, and without further ado, let's get started. To get started, guys, I have my basic bodice patterns right here. I have the front here and this is the back. So guys, these patterns are going to form the base for our notch collar. This is what we are going to be modifying. To move on with the modification, I left about 2.5 inches away from the edge of my pattern paper before drafting the front. This right here is the front pattern. The neck width for the front is 2.5 inches and the neck depth is 3 inches, just the standard for a basic bodice pattern. Okay, so to move on, the very first thing I'm going to do is to mark 1 inch away from the center front. And this 1 inch is going to form our button stand and our buttonholes. Okay, so whether you're making this into a jacket or into a dress, you will need to create an extension where your buttons are going to sit in, and 1 inch is fine. After that, I am going to be determining my break point. The break point is where the front would overlap, and I'm marking 2.5 inches above the chest line for my break point. I'm going to be connecting that point to the neck point. Once that is done, I'm also going to be extending the neckline into the buttonhole extension that we marked. After then, it is time for us to draw the lapel, and to draw the lapel I'm going to be marking 1 inch outward this way. However, you can mark more than that, but bear in mind that the more you mark, the bigger the lapel. So I'll mark that right there, and then I'm going to be connecting that point to the break point into a curve. So I'm going to be using the curvy part of my pattern master to draw the curve of my lapel this way. This right here is going to be the lapel. The next thing would be to work on the Revere collar. And to work on the Revere collar, I'm going to be extending the line from the neck point this way. After that, I am going to be measuring the neckline of the back, excluding the seam allowance. So if you look at my pattern, you would realize that I added half an inch seam allowance to the center back. So I'm just going to measure only the neckline of the back minus the half inch seam allowance, and I have about 2.75 inches if I'm correct. Yes, 2.75 inches. That is what I have as a neck width measurement for the back. I'm also going to be connecting that down. I would square it down this way. After squaring it down, I'm going to be marking the width of the collar, and I'm going for 3 inches. You could mark more than that to make your collar wider or bigger. Also, I'll mark half an inch outward this way. This would enable me curve the neckline of the back. So I'm going to be connecting that point to the neck point into a curve. To round up with the Revere collar, I'm going to be marking 0.75 inch inward from the lapel. From that measurement, I would angle my tape and mark another 0.75 inches outward. I would use my ruler to connect those 2 points together. Once that is done, I will then connect this part to this part of my collar. So guys, I am done following the move of my marker all the way from here, through the width of the collar, through the back neckline, and the front neckline is going to be my Revere collar. To move on, I would proceed to draw in my dart. I added 1 inch for dart allowance, so I'm just going over to mark the midpoint of my waistline, and I'm marking half an inch on both sides. After then, I'm proceeding to draw my dart legs. So I have my waist dart there. The next thing I will do is to get the midpoint of the shoulder slant. That's because I want to have a seam over there. Get the midpoint and connect it to the waist dart. Also, I'm going over to mark my bust dart, and that is 1 inch below the bust line. I would also connect that to the waist dart. So guys, at this point you can be creative about how you want your collar to look. You can leave the edges pointed the way it is, which is like the standard, or you can make it curvy, which is the style that I'm going for. So in order to make it curvy, I'll just use my hand to draw a curved line from one part of the lapel to meet where the Revere collar meets. So this is where the Revere collar meets with the lapel. I'll also curve the other part of the Revere collar. So instead of my collar to be pointed, it's going to be curvy this way, and this is the style that I'm going for. The next thing I will do is to transfer the Revere collar onto another pattern paper, and to do that I'm going over to place another pattern paper underneath my original pattern. Using my pins to secure the both pattern papers together, I'm going to be grabbing my tracing wheel and I will trace the Revere collar only onto the new pattern paper. While tracing, I would also make sure I trace where the Revere collar and the lapel meet. This is very, very important. Also, I will trace where the Revere collar meets at the neck point. This is also equally important. Once that is done, I would remove all of my pins and then I light my Revere collar on the fresh pattern paper. If you have watched to this point guys and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please click on the subscribe button below. Also turn on your notifications for more videos. Looking at this guys, you would realize that my Revere collar is an exact replica. The only difference was the seam allowance, which I added all around. To move on, I would need to close the bust dart, and in order to close the bust dart, I would need to slash open the line I have along the shoulder slant, and I've gone over to close that. I'm also going over to trim off the excess pattern paper I have along the lapel area. Once that is done, I would also go over and eliminate the waist dart. After that, I also went ahead to proceed to trim off the side of the pattern, but I realized at this point that I have not drawn my armhole, and that is what I am going over to do. Once I was through with that, I went ahead to trim out my pattern neatly. Guys, these are my pattern pieces. I have the front pattern and also the back. Now you would notice that the bulk of the modification was done on the front pattern, while the back pattern had little to no modification. In fact, no modification. For the front, I am going to be cutting 4 pieces. I know I wrote 2, but I went ahead to cut 4 for the center front, while for the side front, I went ahead to cut just 2 pieces. If you would be adding a lining, you would need to cut extra 2 pieces for your lining. But because of the front lapel that would roll over, you will need to cut 4 pieces of your fashion fabric. Also for the back, you will need to cut 2 pieces, and that's because I am splitting the back into 2. But if you're not splitting the back into 2, you will just be cutting 1 piece for the back. I have my Revere collar right here. You can see how it sits nicely into the lapel. So I'm also cutting 4 pieces for the Revere collar. The next thing I'll do is to cut all of these out as I have illustrated. So guys, I am done cutting out, and here is what I have. I went ahead to cut out 4 pieces for the center front, and as you can see, I also ironed in interfacing along the lapel area down where the buttons would be, just to give it some level of structure and volume. I also have my side front right here, though I didn't cut a lining for this because I'm not going to be lining it. Moving on to the back pattern, I splitted the back pattern into 2. You can see it right here. So I'm going to be having a seam along the center back area. Also, I cut out facing for the back. I know I did not illustrate this in the pattern, but I just took out a little part of the back for the facing, so you can see that it's an exact replica of some parts of the center back. For the Revere collar, I cut out 4 separate pieces, and on each of those pieces I ironed in interfacing on each one of them, also for structure and stability. To begin sewing, I'm going to be joining the center front and the side front together. I added half an inch seam allowance while I was cutting, so I would place right sides against each other and join them together along this part. For the back, the first thing I will do is to pick my dart first of all. Also, I'm going to be joining it together along the center back where I splitted it into 2. For the back facing, I'm also going to be joining it together along the center back. So I would place right sides against each other and also stitch it down. I am also going to be doing likewise for the Revere collar. I'm going to be joining a pair together along the height of the collar. So placing right sides against each other, I will join it along this part. I am done sewing as I illustrated. This is the front, center front and side front joined together. I also went ahead to iron open my seam lines so as to make my work appear neat. I also have the back right here. The darts, I've gone ahead to pick them, and I also joined it together along the center back, and I equally ironed it open, the seam lines open. So guys, the next thing I will do is to join both the front and the back only along the shoulder seam for now, just only along the shoulder seam. Here is my Revere collar, and I've gone ahead to join it together as I illustrated. I also gave it a really good press. This part of my collar is going to be sitting into my neckline, while the other part, this part here, is going to be on the outside. Now, in order to process my collar, I would place right sides against each other. Remember, the notch I indicated on my pattern while drafting. I transferred that notch also to my fabric. Now when I want to sew, I'm going to start my sewing process from this notch. So I'll just pin it down and then also locate the other notch. But while locating, I'm also going to be matching up the center seam together, and this right here is the other notch on the other end of the collar. So I'm also going over to pin that down too. So when I want to sew, I'm going to start my sewing from one notch and take it through the other notch, leaving the part that sits into the neckline open. I'm not going to be stitching that part. So far so good, guys. This is what I have. I have gone ahead to join both the front and the back together along the shoulder seam. At this point, I have not ironed the seam, but I would advise you to iron yours as you sew. For my collar, this was what I was explaining to us. I took the seam from one notch and I ended it at the other notch. So what I'll do is to trim this out. I decided to show us how I did this, so just watch closely. After that, I am going to be turning the collar inside out, and once that is all done, I would also iron this collar so that it is flat. The next step is to join the facings together. So the facing for the front and the facing for the back, I'm going to be joining them together along the shoulder seam. Afterwards, it is time to fix the Revere collar. So this is my collar right here, and then it is time for me to fix this. In order to fix this, I'm going to be pinning my collar onto my fabric. So picking up the collar, that center seam I have on the collar, I would match it to the center back seam. After that, I would locate the notch where the both collars join, where the lapel collar and the Revere collar join. I will match it up. So this part here that I ironed out, I'm going to be matching it up to that notch. After that, I'm also going to be pinning around the neck point, the shoulder slant. Remember, we also transferred this notch onto our pattern, so I'll just go over and pin that down, and then I can now pin my collar all around the neckline. However, you might experience some difficulty like I am having here, so what you can do is to create tiny little snips around your neckline just to open it up a little bit, and then you can proceed to pin your collar all around your neckline without any difficulty. I would also repeat the process for this other side too. Once I am through, I went ahead to sew this down. This is the outcome of what I just explained. My collar is well fixed all around the neckline, all through the front and also the back. The next thing I will do is to cover up all of the seam around the collar, and that is why we need the facing. So grabbing my facing, I'm going to be placing it on my fabric appropriately, making sure I place right sides against each other. So that part on my lapel where I created my notch, I'm going to be matching it together, facing and fabric. I'll match it up together. I'll also match up the shoulder seam. Remember, we have the shoulder seam on the facing and the shoulder seam on the main fabric. I'll also match up the center back the center back on the facing and the center back on the fabric. So I'm just going to match up crucial points and then I'll proceed and sew it all the way down. I am done sewing, so this is what I have. So you can see that all of those the seam around the neckline is covered. The raw edges of the lapel area is also covered, so you will need to iron in order to achieve a clean effect. The next thing I will do is to now join this together along the sides. So at this point I'll just join it together by the seam allowance that I added. So guys, just giving you all a close-up look of what I have done so far. This is what the collar looks like. This is the rounded shape that I went for. This is the outcome. This part is also where I'm going to be fixing my buttons and making my buttonholes. And this is how the back of the collar looks like. I love the outcome of this collar already. I can't wait to wear this dress. I went ahead to cut out a half circle skirt which I fixed to the waistline. So this is going to be a sort of a skater dress, and I also fixed a simple sleeve for this dress. So what I have left to do is to just create my buttonholes and attach my buttons, and my dress is ready to be worn. If you found this tutorial really helpful, make sure you give it a huge thumbs up. If you have seen this tutorial up until this time and you haven't subscribed, please click on the subscribe button below and feel free to share this content. Until my next video guys, make sure you stay blessed and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.